Hi guys, welcome back to the pit. What you are seeing here is my completed Normandy farmhouse and yard. If you like my work, please remember to like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. So just to catch you up to speed, I've been building a bolt action table based on a real life town called Bougie, which saw some action in World War II. The board I'm building is made up of 3 modules, containing the intersection of 4 main roads at the centre of the town. I'm still working on the first board, and have completed the school, orchard, and roads that are within it. The last section of the board to be built is the farmyard, which is what I'll be working on in this video. Here is where the farmyard will be located, a terraced pad, backing onto a sloping field and on the corner of 2 of the main roads. The yard will be encompassed by perimeter walls. Looking at this 19th century map, you can see there is an outbuilding set against the perimeter wall along the front of the farmyard, the remnants of which you can still see today. So I decided to incorporate a barn into the front section of the wall. Here, in this mid-20th century map, you can see that the farmhouse is facing the yard entrance at the intersection, so I decided to place the farmhouse in a similar position on my board. I marked out the positions of the house, the barn, which I intend to make into a rustic stone building, and the walls. I also wanted a gravel driveway leading to the house, which will have a stone patio, a simple lean-to structure containing firewood, a stone fountain, where I want to set up a rural working scene like the one in this postcard, a cart of some description, and finally, a rough road crossing through the property. And then I got to work. I started the project by building the perimeter walls. Looking at the wall today, or what's left of it, the photos from winter 2010 have the best view. The wall runs along the field to its rear, and then runs up the slope on Rue des Ordonnes, and I assume then continued around the corner on Rue des Harris. What do you think of my French accent? I originally built this using model rail stone textured sheets. I also took some artistic license and built a set of stairs in the middle to improve gameplay. However, I wasn't happy with the look and decided that I wanted the walls to match the character of the stone farmhouse that I built earlier. So I scrapped the walls and began again using 3mm foam core board, cutting 3cm high strips for the rear and side sections. I then cut the bottom of the side section to match the slope of Rue des Ordonnes. I incorporated a small barn into the wall section that runs along Rue des Harris. Next, I cut out the pitch side walls and front wall of the barn, with a large front door and small window, and then glued them all together with liquid nails. I then cut small stones from thin cork sheets, varying their length and thickness. These would form the stone texture on the walls and barn. The first cork pieces to be attached were the end stones, covering the exposed foam. These were 3mm thick and 50mm high, matching the wall's thickness. Next, I added rectangular and square stones to create cornerstones, door frames, and window frames on the structure. With the cornerstones in place, I began gluing the stones into the remaining blank space, both front and back. And to finish off the walls, I added cork capstone pieces, which were 1 by 2 centimeters. And once the glue was dry, I created mortar using gap filler, which is a cheap, durable material. I applied the filler with a spatula, and then used a wet finger to work it into the crevices. A damp cloth was used to dab the surface, ensuring the excess filler was removed from the stone faces so they kept their natural rough texture. The walls were then undercoated and then given a base coat of Vallejo buff. I picked out random stones in grey, brown, and white, to create stone colour variation. A soft tone wash was applied over the whole surface. Then I added a mortar layer using a mix of white and grey pigment, water and PVA glue. Again, I dabbed the stones to keep the faces from being completely covered by the pigment. A final dry brush brought out the texture and completed the paintwork. For the stairs, I cut 3 pieces of foam, each smaller than the last by 1 cm. I glued them one on top of the other, largest to smallest, and applied some paint, and that was it. The stairs and the back and side sections of the wall were then glued into place. After all this, I built a roof and floor for the barn section. For this build, I wanted a rustic tin roof, typical of rural outbuildings in Normandy. I used corrugated plasticard and cut a strip matching the width of one side of the roof's pitch. That strip was then divided into equal sized panels. The panels were overlapped slightly and glued together to form a single continuous roof pitch, just a little wider than the barn itself. Using a pin and a hand drill, I added 2 rows of screw impressions along the roof. The 2 sides were then joined using a length of angle strip to form the ridge. To add a little bit more detail, I added exposed battens underneath the roof. These were made of styrene strips, glued flush along the roof's edge and butting up against the barn wall. The tin roof was painted light grey, while the battens were painted brown. I then applied a dark wash to add depth and grime. A light dry brush of oily steel was used on the upper surface to bring out the metallic highlights. Dark rust pigment was then dabbed onto the surface using a rough sponge. Then followed by a lighter rust pigment using a smaller sponge. I built the floor using embossed card, which I painted and weathered in a similar fashion to the walls. With that complete, I moved on to create the other major features of the farmyard. The first element would be a water fountain, inspired by this Normandy postcard. These old postcards are a fantastic historical reference. The caption on this one roughly translates to, "The servants prepare to make butter." I wanted to capture a similar atmosphere, with a stone fountain surrounded by barrels, buckets, and jugs to suggest a working farm environment. The fountain in this postcard's a little bit covered by this stamp, but I want to create a similar stone structure. I cut the fountain's base, neck, and cap from construction foam. A ball of aluminium foil was then pressed against the foam to give it a rough stone texture. The pieces were then glued together. After painting the fountain, I used a curved faucet piece from another kit and glued it onto the top to act as a spout. I then convert some jars from a Mantic Games kit into jugs by gluing thin strips of styrene onto them as handles. These would later be placed around the fountain to create that sort of working environment. I also wanted to create one of these stone carved feeding troughs that I see so often in photos of Normandy. Again, I built this out of 1 cm thick construction foam. I cut out the overall shape and then rounded the edges with a file. I then trace out the basins, then begin carving them out with a hobby knife. I then filled the basin with a gap filler and painted it up. Then once dry, I added AK still water into each basin. And then finally, I made a simple lean-to structure. The roof was cut from a square of corrugated card. The rafters, support posts and beams were made from a styrene strip. For the rear beam, I used a pin to add nail holes just for that extra bit of detail. I painted up all the pieces but left the lean-to unassembled for now. With the main features complete, I moved on to the scatter terrain. My goal was to fill the yard with farm-related clutter. Farm tools, equipment, barrels, cartwheels, timber, and all the other everyday items you'd expect to see in a Normandy farmyard. I assembled and painted up some generic scatter terrain. I also purchased these cart kits from Temu, which turned out to be pretty decent. After giving them both a base coat, I realized I didn't like the pre-molded cargo attached to the carts. I began snapping each piece off, right up until I reached the barrel, which was far more stubborn. It took a bit of extra work. That one had to be removed off camera. I assembled one of the carts and left the other unassembled so that I could use the loose wheels in the cart frame. Then for the cargo, I used these miniature hay bales from JTT, which, let's just face it, are adorable. I also glued this miniature axe onto a tree stump. Now with all those components prepared, it was time to sculpt the landscape. I cut out some thin card to pack up the area between the curb and wall, as well as the driveway and fountain area. The exposed edges, anything not pressed up against another structure, were then filed down to create a smooth, gradual slope. I glued these in place, leaving space for the wall. And then smoothed it all out using gap filler. And before the filler dried completely, I ran this model car through the road section to create these realistic tyre tracks. And after everything had dried, I painted the ground brown. With the terrain base painted, I then glued the barn and house down into position. I then taped off the curbs and began applying light earth paste to the driveway and road. And then I mixed light and dark earth to create the soil around the rest of the yard. With the soil done, it was time to lay down the grass. I have to admit, this part was pretty awkward. I had to mask up the board like I was performing surgery on it. Then I spread down the glue, leaving space for trees, the lean-to, and other bits and pieces of terrain. And upon that, I put down a layer of 2mm summer grass. Once that was complete, I tipped the board over to get rid of the excess grass. And then I added a few spots of 4mm dark green grass. With the basics taken care of, it was time to pull it all together, the most exciting part of the whole project. I started by dry applying European earth pigment to the paths and bare patches of earth. I've only recently started applying pigment in this way, and I'm in love with it. It's just so much more realistic. I glued the beams and support posts for the lean-to into place, leaving the roof off for now so I could continue working around the structure. The fountain was then fixed into position. Around the base of the fountain, I applied wet European earth pigment to embed it naturally into the scene. I also applied this pigment to the edges of the light earth sections of the board. Desert dust pigment was then used to create worn tyre and wheel tracks on the driveway and road, giving the ground surface a well-used appearance. To give the grass a bit of character, I used medium green meadow foliage. I tore irregular pieces from the mat, stretched and shaped them, and glued them down in random natural patches. For the paths around the far side of the farmhouse, I used dark green foliage, placed up against the wall. Again, I tore and shaped pieces so they looked organic and overgrown. In the narrow areas between the walls and curb, I used Heki wildgrass, which is another fantastic material. I then mixed this with various tufts to create a wild, chaotic look. And then finally, I went crazy with the tufts along the road and driveway edges. This softens the transition between soil and grass and creates a more natural outline. And somewhere during all this, I added this working gate from a Rubicon kit. I love it. And then I just went to town again and laid down all the scatter terrain I'd prepared earlier. And once all the scatter terrain was laid down, I glued down some dead leaves just for the final layer of realism. And then I called the project done. I'm really happy with the result, and I've picked up a few techniques and materials that I intend to keep using, namely ground foliage, wild grass, and dry applied pigments. Thank you all for watching.